What if everything you admire about ancient Athens was built on something unthinkable? The statues, the schools, the democracy the whole world praises. All of it stood on a foundation most people have never heard about, and those who have rarely speak of it. In this video, we're not just talking about forgotten wars or lost architecture. We're talking about the bodies behind the myths, the lives behind the marble, and the voices that were silenced so completely you were never meant to hear them. You'll learn how boys were bought and sold like trophies. Philosophers used words to justify unspeakable acts, and how the very idea of civilization was weaponized to protect power and erase pain. But that's only the beginning. Because the real question isn't just what Athens did, it's how much of that same logic still lives today. Stay until the end, because the last truth we uncover may be the one that changes how you see history forever. In the golden light of the Athenian Acropolis, tourists snap photos, voices echo in admiration, and tour guides speak reverently of democracy, philosophy, and the birth of Western civilization. They walk the marble paths once tread by Socrates and Plato, imagining intellectual debates and the rise of enlightened governance. But few, if any, pause to consider what existed in the shadows of those same columns, beneath the polished ideals, behind the philosophical treatises. There, hidden by millennia of myth-making and selective memory, lived another Athens, one built not only on ideas but on bodies. The Athens we are taught to admire was a place of immense contrast. For every idealist who preached about virtue and wisdom, there were unrecorded voices, boys, often not more than children, who endured a life behind curtains of silence. Their stories don't survive in polished dialogues or heroic epics. They persist in fragments, in the gaps of texts, in bones buried without names. This was a world where power didn't merely govern, it possessed, it catalogued, priced, and prepared. In the bustling markets of Athens, human beings were commodities, and among them, certain boys were singled out for something more specific, something that culture dressed up in the language of mentorship and beauty. While citizens praised the pursuit of knowledge, they also established a brutal economy that consumed youth. The trade in young boys wasn't a secret. It wasn't whispered behind closed doors. It was institutional, legal, celebrated by some, ignored by most. These children were sold with receipts, trained with discipline, and branded, literally, as property. Families in desperate situations sold sons to survive. Raiders supplied the rest. Entire economic networks existed for the acquisition, preparation, and distribution of these boys. What made a boy valuable in this hidden marketplace wasn't his strength or labor potential. It was his appearance. Fair skin, symmetrical features, gentle mannerisms, traits that, in another life, might have been praised in poetry, here translated into currency. Buyers sought ideal proportions, not to elevate these children, but to consume them as status symbols. For some, the purchase of a beautiful boy was no different than acquiring a fine vase or a rare book. The journey began in the markets, but it didn't end there. Boys deemed suitable were placed into training houses, a euphemism for preparation centers. These institutions weren't run by teachers. They were managed by those who had aged out of the same system. Former courtiers, entertainers, and broken survivors. They knew exactly what their students would face, and they trained them for it. Here, children learned poetry and music, not for self-expression, but to entertain. They were taught to pour wine with grace, to laugh on cue, to never flinch. Lessons weren't about growth, they were about performance. Every gesture was calculated, every silence rehearsed, and when the training ended, a final act confirmed the transformation. Branding. Iron was pressed to flesh. The boy became an object. No longer a person under the law, he was inventory. and inventory had use. In the private homes of Athens, far from the agora, a different kind of gathering took place. Known as symposiums, these events have been romanticized as the intellectual salons of antiquity, where men debated ethics, beauty, and the cosmos over wine. But behind the philosophy was performance, and at the center of that performance were the boys. They entered carrying jugs, their bodies oiled and perfumed, dressed in tunics that left little to the imagination. Their role was ceremonial and intimate. They filled cups, endured stares, responded to calls, and bore the expectations placed upon them. For many of these children, the evening was a test in silence, in how long they could maintain composure, in how deeply they could suppress fear. Philosophers wrote of love between men and boys as the highest form of affection. They waxed poetic about guidance, virtue, and the nobility of such relationships, but they ignored the imbalance of power, the inability to refuse, the reality that most of these boys were enslaved. They spoke of beauty as though beauty consented. They described affection, and society agreed. The system was so embedded that questioning it meant questioning the very fabric of Athenian culture. Education, law, religion, all aligned to preserve the order. Priests oversaw rituals where boys served in temples. Doctors treated injuries without asking how they were inflicted. Lawmakers drafted codes that protected ownership, not safety. Every institution operated in concert to uphold a hierarchy where boys became the silent scaffolding of a glorious city. The boys who lived through this left behind little. Most names are lost. Most stories reduced to fragments in graffiti, anonymous notes on broken pottery, or passing mentions in court records. A handful are remembered only because they testified under torture or died in ways too public to ignore. One boy jumped into the sea rather than return home. Another disfigured his own face to escape attention. Some tried to flee. Others found escape in fantasy, imagination, or, tragically, in final acts of desperation. And yet, they were not passive. Resistance lived even in the smallest acts: a spilled drink, a misstep, a blank stare that refused to smile. Some sabotaged their roles. Others formed secret communities in the shadows, whispering their mother tongues, protecting one another when they could. In a system designed to erase them, they found ways to remain human. His body absorbed what others refused to carry, and when he could no longer serve, he was dismissed, returned to the market, discarded to the streets, or, in rare cases, recycled into another role, a trainer of new inventory. Some were broken by the cycle, others adapted, carving out a kind of control within the system. A handful built reputations, formed alliances with patrons, leveraged influence. But these were the exceptions that proved the rule. Most faded without record, without voice. Their pain became sediment beneath marble. And yet, buried in the silence, something endured, something refused to be fully erased. It whispers now through ruins, through the contradictions in texts, through the uncomfortable truths that rise when we look too closely at beauty, crafted from suffering. The next time we praise a statue's perfection, we might ask, whose story did it overwrite? Because civilizations are not just built by the names we remember, they are also built by those we are taught to forget. But forgetting requires maintenance, and Athens, in all its elegance, became masterful at curating its memory. Monuments were raised not just to celebrate ideals, but to smother contradictions. Inscriptions chiseled into stone outlasted those etched in flesh. The narrative that survived wasn't a lie, it was a decision, a conscious choice about what would be preserved and what would not. Philosophers whose works shaped Western education seldom wrote about the systems surrounding them, not because they were unaware, but because they had internalized its legitimacy. The suffering of the powerless didn't fit their vision of justice, and so it went unrecorded. Relief carvings adorned temple walls, showing young attendants beside gods, not as victims, but as adornments. In art, these boys were stylized, mythologized, turned into allegories, their fear erased, their autonomy abstracted, their presence made beautiful, but only in service to someone else's glory. And when the system faltered, when foreign powers began to chip away at Athenian dominance, there was no reckoning. The boys disappeared faster than the marble could crumble. No one built shrines to them. No oral traditions preserved their names. The trauma that once sustained empire became a ghost in its foundation. The silence endured, not because the world forgot, but because forgetting was easier than admitting what was remembered. And still, it lingers. Even as ruins crumble and statues lose their detail, the cultural blueprint remains. In the patterns of power, in the architecture of institutions, in the language of mentorship, fragments of that ancient logic persist. The mechanisms refined in Athens did not vanish with the collapse of its empire. They evolved. In later centuries, their echoes appeared elsewhere, in Rome's households, where enslaved children were praised for their discipline and grace. In the halls of European courts, where page boys learned silence early. In colonial schools, where civility was taught with fear and compliance. Modern institutions often pride themselves on values of equality and protection, but scratch the surface and old frameworks resurface. Systems that separate status from vulnerability, that romanticize control as guidance, that mask dominance in rituals of prestige. Today, children are still taught to smile before they understand why, to perform before they are ready, to obey before they have words. We call it education, we call it tradition, and most of the time, we mean well. But echoes from the past do not care about intentions. We still reward appearance over voice. We still assign value before autonomy. We still build systems where the vulnerable are seen, but not heard. The story of Athens is not a closed chapter. It is a mirror left standing. And in its reflection, we see not just the past, but the blueprint of choices we continue to make. Because civilization, at its most fragile, is not threatened by chaos. It is threatened by comfort, by the ease with which we ignore suffering when it becomes routine. And so, the ruins whisper, not to condemn, but to warn. They ask, what are we building today, and at whose expense? Because silence, once installed, rarely removes itself. It passes down, not through records but through habits, through glances exchanged in meetings, through words left unsaid in classrooms, through traditions accepted without question. It becomes a language in itself. The Athens of marble and myth continues to be taught in schools, cast in bronze on pedestals, evoked in speeches about virtue and greatness. Rarely do we pause to dissect the foundation on which that image stands. Rarely do we speak of the exploited, the erased, the intentionally forgotten. But now we must. To remember Athens not only for what it accomplished, but for what it demanded in return. For the young lives it consumed, the voices it silenced, the truths it buried beneath stone and verse. This is not an invitation to destroy the past. It is an invitation to unearth it fully, to see its light and its shadow, to understand that admiration without reflection is just another form of denial. We cannot change what Athens was, but we can decide how we carry its legacy. And that choice begins with listening, not to the loudest, but to the ones who were never allowed to speak. Their silence is not empty. It holds everything that was taken, the names, the laughter, the futures that could have been. And in that silence, if we truly listen, is the blueprint for what justice must become. Not as vengeance, but as restoration. Not by rewriting history, but by telling the parts that were left out. We owe them not pity, but presence, acknowledgement. The courage to say, this happened, and it mattered. Because civilizations are not just built by the stones they stack, but by the stories they choose to carry forward. Let us carry all of them, even the ones that make us uncomfortable, especially those. Part 2 begins not in ruins, but in echoes. Echoes of systems built on silence that never truly ended. Because, while we may believe ancient Athens is long gone, its logic lingers in the bones of modern power. We see it in institutions that reward obedience over inquiry, in traditions that elevate the image of excellence while ignoring what it cost, in schoolbooks that praise democracy but skip the details of who it left behind. The same mechanisms that trained boys to be silent still train individuals to prioritize survival over truth. Different names, different tools, but the structure is recognizable. What was once justified with marble is now justified with policy. What was once written in epic poetry is now dressed in corporate statements and legal language. We've inherited not just the myth of Athens, but its habit of sanitizing the uncomfortable. It's in the boardrooms where power dynamics remain unspoken, in the schools where questioning tradition is seen as disrespect, in the industries where the vulnerable are told they are lucky to be included, even if it costs them their identity. The ancient model of power disguised as virtue is alive. It's softer now, but just as pervasive. It praises potential, yet demands silence. It offers opportunity, but only within lines already drawn. And when someone crosses those lines, by speaking, by remembering, by naming, they are pushed aside, reframed as disruptive rather than honest. So how do we break this pattern? We begin by tracing it, naming it, refusing to let the discomfort of the past make us complicit in the present. Because if ancient Athens was built on ideals and inequality coexisting side by side, then maybe modern society is too. And until we are willing to look directly at that contradiction, we will keep repeating it, one generation at a time. But every system built on erasure creates its own crack. Somewhere in the silence, a question always remains. It may start small, a student asking why a statue is celebrated, a journalist digging past the official version, a survivor refusing to stay quiet. These are the beginnings of rupture, not chaos, but clarity. History doesn't only live in archives, it pulses in policy, in architecture, in language. Every institution has a shadow, and every myth has a cost. If we are to move forward without dragging the weight of denial, we must confront not just what we remember, but how we remember, and who benefits from that memory. It's easier to praise ideals than to dissect the systems that exploited them. Easier to honor the words of philosophers than to investigate what those same thinkers ignored. Easier to study democracy as theory than to see who it excluded in practice. But the cost of that comfort is empathy. The price of that praise is perspective. And without perspective, we repeat what we pretend to outgrow. So the responsibility falls to us, not to shame the past, but to tell it honestly, not to cancel history, but to illuminate it. Because if Athens was the cradle of civilization, then it is also a reflection of how power nurtures beauty with one hand and silences truth with the other. What do we do with that knowledge? We stop mistaking silence for peace. We stop assuming legacy is inherently noble, and we start listening, not to affirm our pride, but to challenge it. The story doesn't end with ruins. It begins with what we choose to build after we've seen clearly. What kind of civilization begins not with denial but with truth? Maybe that is the Athens we still have to invent. And perhaps that invention doesn't begin with architects or leaders or laws, but with witnesses, with those who dare to remember what others worked so hard to forget, with people who understand that telling the whole story is not a threat to greatness, but its foundation. A civilization isn't measured only by what it builds, but by what it refuses to bury, by the voices it restores, by the silences it finally breaks. When we think of progress, we imagine forward motion, but sometimes progress means turning back, to recover the pieces that were left behind, to reassemble what was shattered, to make room for truths that never had space before. That is not regression. That is repair. And in that repair is something deeper than justice, something more powerful than punishment. There is dignity. Dignity for those who were stripped of it. Dignity for those who never knew they had it. Dignity for the future we still have time to build. Let the ruins remain. Let the myths persist. But let the truth rise beside them, not whispered, not footnoted, not half-told. Fully, clearly, loud enough to echo through every marble hall, every classroom, every system that once claimed silence as its strength. Let this be the beginning, not of forgetting, but of finally remembering everything. And once we begin to remember, truly remember, the next question becomes, what do we do with that memory? Because memory, if left unspoken, is just weight. But when given shape, through conversation, through acknowledgement, through action, it becomes a tool, a compass, a confrontation with ourselves and the systems we've inherited. This is where the third part of the story begins. It begins with us, with the uncomfortable conversations we avoid, the institutions we assume are too old to question, the stories we pass down to children, edited, softened, drained of the discomfort that might spark empathy. Athens is not a place on the map anymore. It is a framework, a mirror, a cautionary tale wrapped in pride, and unless we change the questions we ask about it, we will continue to mistake the sculpted surface for truth. How many modern systems still operate on beauty over honesty, on legacy over accountability? How many industries rely on the silence of the vulnerable to preserve the myth of order? We can trace the echoes of ancient logic in the way survivors are disbelieved, in the way institutions protect reputation before people, in the way language is manipulated to make injustice seem acceptable. As it was then, so it is now. This isn't just about Athens. This is about every structure that calls itself civilized while building on silence. So the question we must ask today isn't what happened back then, it's what part of that story are we still living out now? And more urgently, who are we still not listening to? Perhaps it's the child in the classroom whose silence is mistaken for shyness when it's something deeper, something systemic. Perhaps it's the worker whose exhaustion is repackaged as dedication. The whistleblower reframed as troublemaker. The survivor described as confused. Over and over, the script repeats. Just new actors, new costumes, the same choreography. The legacy of Athens isn't just statues and philosophies. It's the normalization of silence, dressed as order, the ritual of elevating the comfortable story while sidelining the difficult one. And that ritual continues, not because people are cruel, but because people are afraid. Afraid of what truth might require. Afraid of dismantling what they've benefited from. Afraid that if we open the door to memory, the foundation might shake. But maybe that's exactly what's needed. Because if a foundation cannot hold the truth, it was never strong to begin with. Real strength is not in perfection. It's in accountability, in growth, in the willingness to rebuild better. And so, we must teach differently. Tell children the whole story, not to burden them, but to prepare them. Remind each other that legacy is not fixed, it's curated, and we are the curators now. Recognize that when we defend silence, we delay healing. When we excuse myths, we preserve harm. And when we listen, really listen, we begin to rehumanize those who history left out. That is how civilizations are truly measured, not by monuments, but by how they treat the truths that threaten their pride. Athens gave us brilliance, yes, but it also gave us warning. And if we only inherit the brilliance, we inherit the blindness too. Let this be the chapter where that cycle ends. But no cycle ends on its own. It requires interruption, intention, the decision to not just see what's been hidden, but to act on it. So what does that look like today? It looks like questioning the stories we've inherited as truths. It looks like asking, who wasn't in the room when this version of history was written? Who paid the price for its beauty? Who disappeared so that others could shine? It means revisiting archives, rereading textbooks, rethinking heroes. It means recognizing that justice isn't something a society claims once. It's something it earns repeatedly. Through reflection, through correction, through the courage to face itself without flinching. This work is not glamorous. It is slow, uncomfortable, and often resisted. But it is necessary. Because every time we choose to tell the truth, especially the parts that shake foundations, we prove that our strength is not inherited, it is created. Just like ancient Athens created its identity through the suppression of others, we now have the chance to create something else. A world where dignity isn't reserved for the celebrated but extended to the silenced. To do that, we must keep listening to the stories history buried, to the questions culture avoids, to the quiet voices that refuse to disappear. Because when we choose memory over myth and truth over tradition, we don't just rewrite the past. We reimagine the future. And maybe that reimagining begins not in institutions but in individuals, in the way we tell stories at the dinner table, in how we frame history in classrooms, in whether we choose to see silence as complicity or an opportunity to speak. Part 4 isn't about looking back anymore. It's about what we build forward, using what we now know, with the voices we once overlooked, placed at the center, not the margins. What if education taught not just about wars and kings, but also about who got left behind in those victories? What if museums curated not only artifacts, but the lives connected to them, the ones never named in the glass descriptions? What if leadership wasn't measured by dominance, but by the space it makes for others to rise? These aren't abstract ideals. They are choices, everyday, personal, cultural. They begin when we no longer excuse systems simply because they're old or powerful or beautiful, when we understand that reverence without responsibility is hollow. To create something better, we must become better stewards of memory. We must protect the right to speak, and just as urgently, the right to be heard. We must look for the patterns that echo ancient harm and ask clearly, why do they still exist? Who do they serve now? And what would it take to end them? Because we are not just inheritors of history, we are its editors. We choose what to silence and what to amplify. We decide who belongs in the footnotes and who deserves the headline. And in that power is the promise that the future doesn't have to be another version of the past. It can be something entirely new if we dare to tell the truth and listen all the way through. Because the truth is not fragile. It is not something that needs to be protected from discomfort. It is something that grows sharper in the light, and the more we bring it forward, the more we center those who were silenced, the more resilient our future becomes. Let this be the beginning of a new architecture, one not built on erasure but on acknowledgement, not on singular greatness, but on collective dignity. That means rewriting the curriculum to reflect complexity. It means erecting monuments not just to triumph, but to survival. It means listening not just to those who speak with power, but to those who've been denied it. This isn't about guilt. It's about clarity, about growing strong enough to carry the whole story, not just the parts that flatter us. Because if we continue to present history as clean and noble, we create generations who are unprepared for the mess and contradiction that real justice requires. We teach them to admire myths instead of understanding people. We teach them to repeat harm, politely, invisibly, without even knowing they're doing it. But if we teach truth, we create something sturdier than pride. We build empathy, discernment, the courage to recognize when something that looks like tradition is really just a relic of fear. We don't need to reject the beauty of Athens. We need to understand what that beauty cost and to decide deliberately that we will not pay the same price again. That is what remembering fully allows us to do, not to dwell in shame, but to choose better, to say clearly, we see the whole of what came before, and we will build forward with nothing left in shadow. Because when nothing is left in shadow, something remarkable happens. People begin to recognize themselves not just in the triumphant, but in the overlooked. History becomes less about worship and more about wisdom. The past becomes usable, not to excuse, but to enlighten. And this shift isn't confined to books or lectures. It reshapes how we design cities, how we build policy, how we raise our children. It filters into journalism, art, architecture, law. It becomes a thread in the fabric of daily life. We begin to ask different questions at every level. Who benefits from how this is remembered? Who is missing from the room where it is being retold? What would it mean to center those voices, not as a token, but as the foundation? We start to value complexity over certainty. We become suspicious of too simple stories, and we learn to sit with discomfort, not to suffer it, but to grow through it. Because that's what empathy demands, the capacity to feel where it hurts and stay. That's what justice demands. Not symmetry, but restoration. Not politeness, but truth. Not another golden myth, but something raw and honest and human. So, let this be our new myth. Not of purity, but of courage. A story in which a civilization is not measured by its statues, but by how bravely it reclaims the voices those statues left behind. And if we can do that, then perhaps the greatness of Athens is not behind us, but ahead, waiting to be redefined by those who were once denied a place in its story. Because history is not a relic, it's a responsibility. And memory is not passive, it's a force. The moment we understand that, the ground beneath our ideals shifts. We stop seeing truth as an inconvenience and start treating it as a compass. The work ahead isn't to cleanse the past, but to complete it. To expand our definition of legacy to include not only the architects of empire, but the ones who held its weight. To speak not only of those who shaped marble, but of those who were shaped by silence. Let the story grow, let it fracture, let it speak in more voices than we've been taught to hear. Because the more voices we carry forward, the more resilient our humanity becomes. The greatness of any civilization does not lie in its myths. It lies in its capacity to evolve beyond them. And when we do, when we finally tell the whole story, name the unnamed and build with memory instead of around it, then we will have done something that no empire has managed before. We will have chosen truth over comfort, and we will have built not just monuments, but meaning. But meaning too must be maintained. And this is where part 5 begins. Because once the story is complete, it cannot sit idle. Memory without movement fades. Awareness without action weakens. Acknowledgement is only the beginning. The 5th part of the story is about vigilance. It's about how easily truth can be co-opted, how quickly even the most honest retelling can become performance, how memory itself, once sacred, can be repackaged, diluted, turned into branding. This happens when history is mined for aesthetics instead of accountability. When uncomfortable stories are retold only to show how far we've come instead of how far we still have to go. When museums feature artifacts of suffering with no mention of the systems that created them. When institutions acknowledge past wrongs but resist present change. Vigilance means refusing to let remembrance become a costume. It means watching how power responds to history being told fully, not just by what it says, but by what it still refuses to do. It means recognizing that the silence of today is not always an echo of the past. It's often a deliberate continuation. What does real remembrance demand? It demands reparation, not always in currency, but in curriculum, in culture, in credibility. It demands restructuring, not just our myths, but our models, the ones that still benefit from old frameworks, the ones that still ask the vulnerable to perform resilience instead of receiving justice. Part 5 is a warning. Even truth, once spoken, can be softened, can be staged, can be sanitized until it threatens no one. So the question becomes, how do we protect the story now that we've reclaimed it? We protect it by refusing to let it become decorative. We protect it by tying memory to action, by ensuring that remembrance shapes policy, not just ceremony. Real remembrance looks like changing who gets to speak and who gets listened to. It looks like funding voices that have been historically ignored. It looks like rewriting the rules of access, not just celebrating survival. It means recognizing when institutions use the language of progress to disguise inertia, when they offer performative sorrow instead of structural repair, when they adopt the aesthetic of inclusion while keeping the core intact. To protect the story, we must also protect those who carry it, the storytellers, the survivors, the researchers and educators who risk backlash to speak honestly. We must build systems that do not just tolerate truth, but depend on it. This means being honest about complicity, not only in what we inherit, but in what we uphold. It means holding space for contradiction, because contradiction is where transformation begins. It means being vigilant, not just on anniversaries, but every day. Not just in museums, but in meetings. Not just in classrooms, but in contracts, laws, and leadership. To remember, then, is to work. To work is to resist forgetting. And to resist forgetting is the only way to move forward with integrity. So let us guard the truth, not as a fragile thing, but as something powerful enough to reshape the world if we let it stay sharp. That is the charge of Part 5. That is how we honor the voices that were once forced to disappear. And yet, to truly honor them, we must go further still, because remembrance alone cannot restore. Awareness alone cannot heal. The final layer of responsibility is not just to know or even to act, but to transform. To ensure the systems we inherit become systems we consciously remake. That transformation begins when we redefine strength, not as the ability to dominate or erase, but as the courage to confront. To look history in the face and say, "We will not look away again." It means designing institutions that don't simply include those who were once excluded, but center them. It means turning apologies into access, memorials into mandates, statements into structure. We must ask, if we truly believe the past mattered, what in our present reflects that belief? This is the long labor of memory. It's not dramatic, it's not glamorous, it is persistent, principled, and often unseen. But it is the only way forward that does not repeat the path behind. Let those once silenced become the standard by which we measure progress. Let those once erased become the architects of what comes next. Because justice is not a destination, it's a direction. And we walk it not with perfect answers, but with unwavering honesty. That is where the story leads, and that is where our work begins. Part 6 opens in the present, not with monuments, but with decisions. Decisions made every day, often quietly, about what to teach, what to prioritize, what to value. This is where transformation either becomes real or fades back into ritual. Because the test of all remembrance is this: can it survive contact with power? Can it inform the laws we write? Can it shape the budgets we pass? Can it live not just in ceremonies, but in the systems that touch people's lives every day? If not, then we have only changed the language, not the reality. Transformation means asking the uncomfortable questions. Who still profits from forgetting? Where do the old hierarchies hide under new names? What narratives are still being protected, not because they're true, but because they're useful? It means shifting from inclusion to co-creation, from giving a voice to sharing the mic, from never again to not anymore, starting now. This work requires leaders who are willing to lose status to gain justice, institutions willing to be remade, not just rebranded, communities willing to hold both grief and hope without collapsing into cynicism. And above all, it requires memory that does not flinch, that does not seek comfort at the cost of clarity. Part 6 is not a conclusion. It is a challenge, not just to remember differently, but to live differently because of what we remember. And if we accept that challenge, then history is no longer a burden we carry. It becomes a blueprint we rewrite together. And what we build from that blueprint matters. Will we construct systems that merely look more inclusive, or ones that truly are? Will we create narratives that finally name the invisible, or will we continue to polish the ones that keep them hidden? To live differently because of what we remember means making space for complexity, for contradiction, for voices long pushed to the edges. It means slowing down the impulse to explain and speeding up the instinct to listen. It means institutions that don't just welcome feedback, but transform because of it. It means recognizing that justice, like memory, is not a destination. It's a practice, a living, breathing process that must be tended every day. And yes, it will be uncomfortable. Accountability always is. But in that discomfort is the evidence of progress. Not the kind you put in headlines, but the kind that outlasts them. Quiet, structural, real. This is how we honor memory, not with perfection, but with persistence. Not with statues, but with systems. Not with pageantry, but with principle. Because when remembrance becomes policy and empathy becomes structure, we don't just prevent the past, we replace it with something stronger, something fairer, something new. This is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of what comes next. And the question is no longer, what happened then? The question now is, what will we do, now that we know?